The most dangerous transformation in a man's life doesn't happen through failure. It happens through love. One day you see a man standing in a grocery store on a Saturday morning, staring at shelves of food he never chose, calculating whether he can afford a brand of cheese he doesn't even like. His shoulders are lower. His eyes are quieter. He checks a list written in handwriting that isn't his. This is the same man who once argued ideas until 3 a.m., who quit jobs on principle, who drove across the country with no plan and no permission. The change didn't arrive with a fight. It arrived with compromise, with reason, with maturity. That's what makes it invisible. What if the loss of male independence isn't accidental? What if it's engineered slowly, patiently, through promises of partnership and stability? This isn't a story about bad marriages. It's about a system that turns confident men into compliant ones without them ever noticing. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if this kind of psychological truth matters to you, subscribe. Calmly, intentionally. I started noticing it long before I had language for it. It wasn't one dramatic moment. No explosion, no clear line where everything changed. It was quieter than that, more efficient. The kind of shift you only recognize in hindsight, when the distance between who someone was and who they've become feels too wide to explain with a single decision. I would see men in familiar places, suburban streets on weekends, parking lots outside hardware stores, the slow-moving lines of grocery stores on Saturday mornings. Men who looked functional, stable, responsible, and deeply hollow. Their posture told the story before their words ever did. Shoulders slightly rounded, eyes alert but not curious, movements precise but cautious, as if every action had been pre-cleared. These weren't weak men. That's what made it unsettling. These were men who once led teams, men who took risks, men who made decisions under pressure, men who trusted their judgment enough to act on it. Somewhere along the way, that trust had been replaced with something else. Permission-seeking, second-guessing, a low-grade anxiety that never quite turned off. What struck me most was how normal it all looked. Walk through any American suburb on a Sunday afternoon and you'll see it everywhere. Lawns trimmed to regulation height, driveways washed, families moving in coordinated schedules, and men once decisive, once sharp, now operating like support staff in their own lives. Asking before acting, explaining before choosing, negotiating for small allowances of autonomy as if they were privileges, not birthrights. The transformation didn't announce itself. That's the genius of it. No one wakes up one morning and decides to surrender their independence. It happens through a series of reasonable steps, each one defensible, each one framed as growth, as love, as responsibility. I've watched men rationalize the change in real time. They say things like, "It's not a big deal. This is what adulthood looks like. You can't live like you're single forever." And on the surface, they're right. Life requires adjustment. Commitment demands consideration. But what I was seeing went far beyond adjustment. It was erosion. Bit by bit, the man's internal authority was being outsourced. He no longer trusted his instincts without external confirmation. He no longer acted from desire, only from approval. His decisions became reactions to expectations rather than expressions of will. And the most disturbing part was this: he believed this meant he was maturing. I've heard men say with pride, "I run everything by her now," as if that were evidence of wisdom rather than surrender. What they didn't see was that something essential had gone quiet inside them. Not killed, not destroyed, just muted. like a voice that stopped speaking because no one listened anymore. This is where the real danger lives, not in overt control, but in internal compliance. The men I observed weren't being forced. They were adapting. They weren't being dominated. They were optimizing for peace. Conflict avoidance replaced truth. Harmony replaced honesty. And slowly the cost of asserting themselves began to feel higher than the cost of disappearing. Over time, the man learns which parts of himself create friction and which parts are rewarded. He trims accordingly. He smooths his edges. He edits his opinions. He softens his ambitions, not because anyone explicitly demands it, but because the feedback loop is clear. Certain behaviors lead to tension, others lead to calm, and calm becomes the goal. This is how independence dies, without resistance. I've watched men who once challenged authority become deeply uncomfortable with disagreement. Men who once spoke freely now choose words with surgical caution. Men who once acted decisively now delay consult and defer until the moment passes and the decision is made for them. They call this being considerate. But consideration without self-respect is just submission with better branding. What makes this transformation so effective is that it doesn't feel like loss while it's happening. Each step feels small, necessary, mature. The man tells himself he's choosing stability over chaos, responsibility over recklessness. And in doing so, he never notices that his life is becoming narrower. His world shrinks, fewer spontaneous choices, fewer unscheduled hours, fewer people who know him as he was. Until eventually, the only version of himself that exists is the one that fits inside the system he now serves. And the system rewards him for it. He's praised for being reliable, for being supportive, for being a good husband. He's told he's doing everything right, that he's winning at adulthood. And on paper, it looks true. The house, the routine, the predictability. But internally, something feels wrong. There's a restlessness he can't explain, a low-level dissatisfaction that never fully surfaces, but never goes away. He feels busy but unfulfilled, needed but unseen, valued for what he provides, not for who he is. Yet he doesn't question the structure. He questions himself. He assumes the discomfort is personal weakness, immaturity, ingratitude. He tells himself to be better, to be more patient, to be more understanding. And so the cycle deepens. This is why the change is so hard to detect. The man participates in his own transformation. He becomes the enforcer of the very rules that limit him. He polices his own impulses before anyone else has to. By the time he notices something is wrong, the old reference points are gone. The friends who remember him differently have drifted away. The habits that grounded him have been abandoned. The confidence he once had feels foreign, almost irresponsible. And so he adapts again. He accepts the new normal because it's familiar, because everyone around him seems to be living the same way, because no one ever told him there was another option. This isn't about villains, it's about design. A system doesn't need malicious intent to produce predictable outcomes. It only needs incentives, pressures, rewards, and enough time. What I was watching wasn't a series of isolated relationships failing. It was a pattern, repeated too consistently to be coincidence. Independent men entering a structure that quietly reshaped them into something more manageable, more predictable, less dangerous to the stability of the system itself. And the men didn't rebel. They adjusted. They told themselves this was love, that this was growth, that this was what winning looked like now. By the time the question finally surfaced, when did I stop being myself? They no longer knew how to answer it. Before anything is taken, something is promised. That promise is partnership. Two adults, two equals, walking side by side, sharing burdens, sharing victories. A clean, reasonable vision of adulthood where no one carries the weight alone. I understand why it works. I believed it too. Who wouldn't want an ally in a world that feels increasingly hostile and uncertain? That's how it's framed, as a merger of strengths, as mutual reinforcement, as teamwork. But what I began to notice over years of watching this play out was a quiet mismatch between the language and the outcome. What was sold as partnership often evolved into something else entirely. Not through deception, but through structure, through incentives, through default settings no one ever questions. In theory, partnership implies shared authority. In practice, modern marriage often reorganizes power while preserving the illusion of equality. The transition is subtle. It starts with language, our money, our plans, our future. The words sound inclusive, mature, responsible. And yet very quickly, the execution becomes asymmetrical. It's our money, but she manages the budget. It's our schedule, but she sets the calendar. It's our life, but she decides the direction. None of this happens overnight. That's the point. At first, it feels efficient, logical. One person takes the lead in certain areas to reduce friction. Decisions get centralized. Processes get streamlined. The man tells himself he's not losing authority. He's delegating. He's being practical. And delegation feels harmless when you believe you can always take control back. But authority, once surrendered, rarely returns on its own. What I saw again and again was the same slow reclassification of roles. The man remains responsible, but no longer decisive. He becomes the executor rather than the architect, the provider rather than the chooser. He funds the plan. He maintains the system. He solves the problems that arise from decisions he didn't fully make. And because he's still working, still contributing, still essential, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like duty. That's the psychological trick. If a man were suddenly stripped of agency, he would resist. But when agency is exchanged for responsibility, he accepts it willingly. Responsibility sounds noble, masculine, adult. Agency sounds selfish by comparison. So he leans into the role. He works longer hours. He becomes more reliable, more predictable. He prides himself on being steady, on being the one others can count on. And gradually, his identity shifts from the man who chooses to the man who provides. Provision becomes the moral justification for surrender. I've watched men defend this shift aggressively. If you question it, they bristle. They tell you this is what real men do, that freedom is overrated, that stability matters more than impulse. And again, none of that is entirely false, but it's incomplete. Because what's being reframed as maturity is often just compliance with a system that no longer requires male independence to function. The original promise was shared strength. What emerges instead is managed contribution. The man's role becomes clear over time. Earn, support, maintain, adapt. And adaptation becomes the core skill. He learns quickly which decisions are welcome and which ones create friction. He adjusts accordingly. Not consciously at first. It's instinctive. Like touching a hot surface and learning where not to place your hand. Certain ideas are met with silence. Certain preferences are dismissed as impractical. Certain ambitions are labeled risky or unrealistic. So he edits himself. He stops proposing. He starts waiting. He learns to read the room before speaking. He asks questions instead of making statements. What do you think? How do you feel about this? Is this okay? Each question feels polite, respectful, but cumulatively, they transfer authority outward. Over time, decision-making becomes centralized elsewhere. The man is still involved, but no longer sovereign. He participates, but he does not lead. And because the transition is gradual, he never marks the moment when the balance tipped. He only notices later when he hesitates before making even small choices. When buying a beer feels like a negotiation. When taking an afternoon for himself requires justification. When rest feels earned rather than allowed. That's when the partnership illusion starts to crack. Because equal partners don't ask permission to exist. What makes this dynamic so effective is that it's reinforced socially. Friends, family, culture all echo the same message. This is what commitment looks like. This is what responsibility demands. This is what good men do. Any resistance gets reframed as immaturity. Any desire for autonomy becomes selfishness. Any boundary becomes a threat to the relationship. So the man doesn't resist. He reframes himself. He tells himself he's choosing peace. That compromise is strength. That leadership means sacrifice. And in some contexts, that's true. But here, sacrifice is one-directional, and leadership has been reduced to compliance with someone else's vision. The most telling sign appears when the man stops initiating his own life. He reacts instead. He responds to needs, to requests, to expectations. His days are structured around obligations rather than intentions. He moves from task to task, useful and efficient, but increasingly disconnected from any internal sense of direction. Ask him what he wants, and he struggles to answer. Not because he doesn't want anything, but because wanting has become inconvenient, risky, easier to suppress than to negotiate. So desire atrophies, initiative fades, and what remains is a quiet, disciplined functionality. This is not partnership, it's management. And the man often doesn't see it because management is framed as care. She's just better at planning. She's more organized. She thinks ahead. All true. And none of it requires the man to disappear for the system to function. Yet disappear, he does slowly, politely, voluntarily. By the time the structure is fully in place, the roles feel fixed, natural. I've heard men say, that's just how it is, with the same resignation you hear from someone describing the weather. They no longer imagine alternatives. That's when the transformation is complete. Not when authority is lost, but when the idea of reclaiming it no longer occurs. The promise of partnership did its job. It opened the door. What followed wasn't cruelty or conspiracy. It was design. Quiet, incremental, effective. And once the man adapts fully, once he internalizes the role, the system no longer needs to enforce anything. He enforces it himself. Once authority shifts, dependency follows. This is where the structure locks itself in place. Not emotionally at first, but economically. Quietly. Through systems that look responsible on paper and feel suffocating in practice. Modern marriage doesn't just merge lives. It fuses finances, joint accounts, shared mortgages, combined credit, intertwined assets, every piece sold as commitment, as trust, as adulthood done right. And again, each step makes sense in isolation. Pooling resources reduces friction. Shared goals require shared planning. Stability demands coordination. But when I watched closely, I saw how this architecture created something far more powerful than cooperation. It created leverage. The man's earning power becomes central to the system, but his control over how that power is used diminishes. He works, he produces, he provides. And yet, the authority to decide where those resources go gradually migrates away from him. At first, it's framed as competence. She's better with budgets. She's more detail-oriented. She thinks long-term. So he defers. Not because he must, but because it feels efficient. Then it becomes expectation. Major purchases require discussion. Discretionary spending invites scrutiny. Personal indulgences need justification. He begins to notice that money he earns no longer feels like his. It belongs to a collective vision he didn't fully design. A house he didn't choose. A lifestyle he adapted to. Standards he never set, but is now responsible for maintaining. And still, he tells himself, this is normal. This is what providing looks like. But psychologically, something corrosive is happening. His labor has become disconnected from his agency. Effort without authorship. Work without ownership. And that separation is devastating to the male psyche. Men are wired to build toward self-chosen goals. When effort serves a vision they believe in, they thrive under pressure. But when effort fuels objectives imposed by structure rather than desire, motivation collapses inward. What replaces it is resignation. I've watched men work longer hours than ever before while feeling less fulfilled than they ever did. They come home exhausted, not just physically, but existentially. They're tired of solving problems that never feel like progress. Tired of chasing a finish line that keeps moving. They are not building their lives. They are maintaining someone else's. This is where psychologists use the term learned helplessness. When repeated experience teaches someone that their actions don't meaningfully affect outcomes, they stop trying to influence those outcomes at all. The man stops proposing alternatives, stops imagining different paths, stops asking what he actually wants. Because experience has taught him that resistance is costly and compliance is smoother. And the system rewards smoothness. Every time he sacrifices a preference for stability, he's praised. Every time he suppresses a desire for the sake of responsibility, he's validated. The feedback loop is clear. Being agreeable keeps the machine running. Being assertive threatens it. So he adapts. He begins to see his role not as a creator, but as an engine. His worth becomes tied to output, to consistency, to reliability. He finds meaning in being needed rather than being known. That's the trade. What makes this particularly effective is how moral language is layered on top of economic dependency. You hear phrases like, "We need to think about the future," or "That's not responsible right now," or "You can't be selfish with money anymore." Each statement sounds reasonable, even virtuous. And that's what disarms resistance. Because the man doesn't want to be irresponsible. He doesn't want to be selfish. He doesn't want to fail as a provider. So he agrees. But over time, these reasonable constraints accumulate into a financial prison. Not because he lacks money, but because he lacks permission to use it in alignment with himself. He works to fund a lifestyle he didn't design. He pays for comforts he doesn't enjoy. He maintains appearances that serve social expectations rather than personal fulfillment. And still he tells himself, this is maturity. The most painful part is how invisible the cost becomes. The man doesn't wake up angry. He wakes up numb. He doesn't feel oppressed. He feels tired. He doesn't dream of escape. He dreams of rest. Because rest has become the only remaining indulgence that doesn't require explanation. When financial dependency reaches this stage, escape becomes terrifying. Leaving doesn't just threaten emotional stability, it threatens economic survival. Assets are tied, obligations are shared. Risk is no longer abstract, it's quantified. The man begins to calculate consequences rather than possibilities. What would it cost to leave? What would I lose? Can I afford independence? and the answers rarely favor freedom. So he stays. Not because he's weak, but because the system has made staying cheaper than leaving. That's how dependency works. It doesn't need force. It only needs incentives aligned against autonomy. Over time, the man internalizes the role completely. He stops seeing the financial structure as something imposed. He sees it as who he is, a provider, a stabilizer, a pillar. He tells himself this is noble. And it is up to a point. But nobility without agency becomes servitude. The tragedy is that most men never name what they're experiencing. They feel dissatisfaction, but can't articulate it. They sense something has been taken, but can't point to a moment of theft. So they turn the discomfort inward. They assume the problem is them. They try to be more grateful, more disciplined, more patient. And in doing so, they tighten the chains themselves. They become more efficient engines, better servants to a system that consumes their energy while slowly hollowing them out. This is why the financial architecture matters so much. Not because money is everything, but because control over resources is control over choice. And when choice erodes, so does identity. By the time a man realizes that his effort no longer belongs to him, that his work serves goals he didn't set, the dependency is already deep. The system is stable, functional, profitable, for everyone except him. And the cruel irony is this: the more responsible he becomes within the structure, the harder it is to imagine life outside of it. The cage doesn't need bars when the floor itself is weighted. Once financial dependence is secured, isolation follows. Not abruptly, not violently, but with patience and plausible deniability. The dismantling of a man's independent social world rarely starts with ultimatums. It starts with questions that sound reasonable, caring even. Don't you think you spend a lot of time with your friends? Wouldn't you rather stay in tonight? They're still acting like they're in college. Each question contains an implication that his friendships are excessive, that his time is misallocated, that his past belongs in the past. And because the man wants to be seen as mature, he listens. This is how male friendship gets reframed from essential to optional. Marriage quietly positions itself as the primary and eventually exclusive source of emotional connection. Time spent elsewhere becomes suspect. Loyalty becomes a zero-sum game, as if attention given to friends is attention taken from the relationship. The man accepts the framing without noticing what it costs him. He cancels a weekly poker night to be more present. He skips a hiking trip to handle household projects. He stops answering texts immediately because he's busy. None of this feels like loss. It feels like prioritization. But prioritization repeated enough times becomes elimination. Male friendships don't usually survive neglect. They require shared time, shared struggle, shared experience. When those disappear, the bonds thin. And slowly, without confrontation or closure, the network dissolves. What replaces it is a narrower world. The man's social life collapses inward. Fewer voices, fewer mirrors, fewer people who remember who he was before his identity became fused with a role. And this is where the psychological consequences deepen. Without external reference points, he loses perspective. There's no one to tell him that what he's experiencing isn't normal. No one to say, you didn't used to sound like this, or you never cared about that before. No one to reflect his old energy back to him. Isolation doesn't just remove support, it removes memory. And that's strategic, whether intentional or not. Men are grounded through shared history, through friendships forged before obligation diluted identity. When those connections fade, the man becomes unmoored from his own past. The timing is precise. Just as he's losing autonomy in other areas, he's also losing witnesses. Without male peers who operate independently, his situation begins to feel universal. He looks around and sees other married men living similarly constrained lives. They joke about it. They normalize it. They call it reality. Happy wife, happy life. The phrase is delivered as humor, but it functions as doctrine. This creates a powerful psychological effect. If everyone is living this way, then this must be how things are supposed to be. The man stops questioning structure and starts questioning himself. Isolation makes conformity feel inevitable. And it serves another purpose: emotional dependency. As friendships fade, the man's spouse becomes his primary, often sole source of emotional validation, companionship, and social interaction. She becomes his partner, his confidant, his social calendar, his emotional regulator. This concentration of emotional power would be destabilizing in any system. One person becomes both the source of approval and the gatekeeper of connection. The man adapts by becoming more agreeable, more attentive, more cautious. He can't afford conflict when conflict threatens his only remaining source of closeness. This is where self-censorship intensifies. He avoids topics that cause tension. He softens opinions before expressing them. He suppresses frustration rather than risk distance. The isolation doesn't just limit his world, it reshapes his behavior. What's particularly effective is how this process is framed as intimacy, as closeness, as choosing each other over the outside world. And in healthy relationships, there's truth in that. But when exclusivity replaces balance, intimacy becomes enclosure. The man's emotional ecosystem collapses into a single point of failure, and without alternative sources of affirmation, he begins to measure his worth exclusively through his spouse's responses. Approval feels like oxygen. Disapproval feels like suffocation. This dependency creates a subtle but powerful shift in power dynamics. The man doesn't need to be controlled overtly. He controls himself. He learns to anticipate reactions, to manage moods, to prevent friction before it arises. His emotional labor increases, while his emotional freedom decreases. Over time, this hyper-attunement becomes anxiety. He checks his phone more often. He reads tone into silence. He interprets neutral comments as signals. Without friends to ground him, everything feels personal. Every interaction carries weight. Every disagreement feels existential. The man becomes smaller, not physically, but psychologically. His world contracts to the size of the relationship. And within that confined space, his room to move narrows. What makes this especially damaging is how it's reinforced by culture. Society praises men who settle down, who prioritize family over friends, who stop acting like boys. Friendship is framed as a youthful indulgence rather than a lifelong necessity. So when the man feels the loss, as he doesn't grieve it, he judges it. He tells himself he's outgrown those connections, that he's evolved, that he's focused now. He reframes loneliness as maturity. But the body doesn't lie. Men deprived of meaningful social bonds don't become wiser. They become brittle, less resilient, more prone to stress and depression. Without outlets, pressure builds inward, and there's nowhere for it to go. By the time the man recognizes how isolated he's become, rebuilding feels daunting. Reaching out feels awkward. He worries he's missed his chance, that the moment has passed, that everyone else has moved on. So he stays silent, and silence becomes the norm. Isolation is not a side effect of this system, it's a stabilizer. It removes resistance. It reduces perspective. it increases dependency. And it does so while wearing the mask of love and commitment. The man doesn't realize he's been separated from his support network until he needs it and finds it gone. At that point, the structure no longer needs to defend itself. There's nowhere else to go. Once isolation is in place, reshaping becomes efficient. This is where the system stops removing things and starts modifying the man himself. Not through punishment, through correction, small, constant, almost invisible. It doesn't arrive as anger. It arrives as advice. You should dress better. You'd feel better if you ate healthier. You spend too much time watching sports. You're capable of more than this. Each comment sounds reasonable, supportive, even loving. And taken alone, none of them seem harmful. In fact, many of them would be harmless in a different context. The damage comes from accumulation. When feedback is constant and one-directional, it stops being guidance and becomes conditioning. The message underneath every suggestion is the same. Who you are as you are is not enough. At first, the man resists internally. He tells himself it's normal, that relationships involve influence, that growth requires discomfort. He tries to separate helpful input from unnecessary critique. But the feedback doesn't stop. It touches everything: his clothes, his habits, his hobbies, his opinions, his priorities, even his tone, even his silence. Nothing is explicitly forbidden. It's simply discouraged. And when the man pushes back, the criticism shifts shape. I'm just trying to help you. I want what's best for you. Why are you so defensive? Now, the problem isn't the critique. It's his reaction to it. This is where the psychological bind tightens. If he accepts the correction, he confirms that something about him needed fixing. If he rejects it, he becomes unreasonable, difficult, uncooperative. Either way, his position weakens, so he compromises. He adjusts a little, then a little more. He modifies himself to reduce friction. He tells himself these changes are voluntary, that he's choosing to improve. But improvement without self-direction is just compliance with better language. Over time, the man's confidence erodes, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a steady leak. He begins to second-guess instincts that once felt solid. He wonders if his preferences are immature, if his interests are pointless, if his judgment is flawed. This is how an internal compass gets replaced. Psychologists call this an external locus of control. When a person no longer trusts their own judgment and begins to rely on external validation to determine what is right, acceptable, or safe, the man starts asking before acting. Is this okay? Do you think this is a good idea? Should I do this? At first, it's about major decisions. Then it spreads. Clothing choices, weekend plans, purchases, even moods. He stops trusting himself to know what he wants without approval. This doesn't feel like weakness while it's happening. It feels like consideration, like respect, like emotional intelligence. And that's why it works. The man becomes easier to guide because he's lost faith in his own authority. What makes this especially powerful is the absence of malice. There's no villain here, no overt domination, just a steady pressure toward a specific shape. And that shape is predictable. Less assertive, more agreeable, more risk-averse. The system doesn't need to crush the man. It only needs to smooth him. Rough edges create conflict. Sharp opinions create tension. Strong preferences complicate planning. So those parts get worn down. Slowly, patiently. The man adapts by becoming more cautious. He measures his words. He edits his reactions. He anticipates disapproval and avoids it before it appears. This constant self-monitoring creates a state of low-grade anxiety. He's always alert, always adjusting, always scanning for signals. He learns to read facial expressions, tone shifts, silence. He becomes emotionally hypervigilant. And hypervigilance is exhausting. The man isn't relaxed anymore, even at home, especially at home. Because home has become a place where his performance is evaluated even if no one says so out loud. Over time, this erodes something fundamental. Confidence isn't arrogance. It's trust in one's own perception. When that trust is undermined, the man loses the ability to stand firmly in himself. He becomes dependent on feedback to know where he stands. Am I doing okay? Are you upset? Is everything fine? The need for reassurance grows as self-trust shrinks. And once confidence is gone, resistance becomes unthinkable. The man doesn't argue because he's afraid of being wrong. He doesn't assert because he's afraid of being selfish. He doesn't lead because he's afraid of misstepping. So he waits. He defers. He follows. What's left is a man who functions but doesn't initiate, who responds but doesn't direct, who exists in a permanent state of adjustment. This is not peace. It's control internalized. The most damaging part is how invisible it all remains. From the outside, the man looks calm, cooperative, easy to live with. People praise him. They say he's grown up, that he's matured. They don't see the internal tension, the constant self-correction, the quiet grief of no longer trusting his own voice. And because the criticism was framed as care, the man feels guilty for resenting it. He tells himself he should be grateful, that many men would be lucky to have someone who cares so much. So he swallows the resentment. He learns to ignore the small ache that appears every time he abandons an impulse, every time he suppresses a reaction, every time he chooses silence over truth. That ache doesn't disappear. It just sinks deeper. This is how a man becomes compliant without ever being commanded. By the time he realizes he no longer knows what he actually thinks, what he actually wants, or what he actually believes, the conditioning has already done its work. He isn't controlled by someone else anymore. He's controlled by the fear of being himself. Once a man no longer trusts his own judgment, removing what remains becomes easy. The system turns its attention to the last places where he still feels like himself. The activities that once gave him energy, the pursuits that existed before responsibility claimed them, the spaces where he felt competent, alive, and autonomous. These things don't disappear through prohibition. They disappear through evaluation. Every activity is measured against utility. Does this make money? Does this improve the house? Does this benefit the family? If the answer is no, the activity is quietly downgraded. Video games become childish. Sports become pointless. Music becomes noise. Reading becomes antisocial. Working on cars becomes messy and unnecessary. None of this is framed as control. It's framed as maturity. The man is encouraged to outgrow these interests, to replace them with more productive uses of time. Home improvement projects, yard work, errands, obligations, tasks that serve the household. He agrees because the logic sounds responsible, because he wants to contribute, because he's already learned that personal joy carries a social cost. So he lets go. At first, it's occasional. He skips a game to finish a project. He postpones a hobby to handle something more important. He tells himself he'll get back to it later. Later rarely comes. What disappears isn't just entertainment, it's identity. These activities weren't distractions. They were anchors. They were where the man felt mastery without permission, where effort led to satisfaction, where time passed without justification. When those spaces vanish, the man loses access to experiences that affirm his competence outside of service. The replacement activities keep him busy, but they don't feed him. Mowing the lawn doesn't create meaning. Fixing a sink doesn't spark passion. Organizing a garage doesn't generate pride. These tasks are necessary, but they are not sufficient. They maintain life. They do not expand it. Over time, the man becomes productive but disengaged, efficient but uninspired. His days fill with responsibilities that never quite satisfy. He begins to confuse exhaustion with fulfillment. And because he is always doing something, no one questions whether he is alive. The psychological cost of this loss is profound. Men derive self-worth through competence, through mastery, through progression. When hobbies and passions disappear, the man loses arenas where progress is visible and self-directed. In their place, he's left with obligations where the finish line keeps moving and the feedback is rarely positive. There's always more to do, always something not done well enough. This creates a chronic sense of insufficiency. No matter how much he does, it never feels like enough. So he does more. This is how burnout becomes normalized. The man doesn't rest because rest hasn't been earned. He doesn't play because play has no utility. He doesn't explore because exploration is inefficient. And without play, without exploration, something essential atrophies. Curiosity fades. Creativity dulls. Desire narrows. The man stops imagining alternative futures because his present consumes all available energy. This is how passion dies without protest. What's especially damaging is how this elimination of joy is framed as moral improvement. He's told he's becoming more responsible, more grounded, more adult. So when he feels empty, he assumes something is wrong with him. He doesn't ask why the system starves him. He asks why he's still hungry. This internalization deepens the control. The man begins to police his own impulses. He feels guilt for wanting things that don't serve others. He dismisses his own desires as trivial. He becomes embarrassed by the parts of himself that once brought him joy. Eventually, he stops wanting altogether, not consciously, but functionally. He fills his time with tasks because tasks don't require desire. They only require obedience. And obedience feels safe. Without passions, without hobbies, without independent pursuits, the man's life becomes narrower and more predictable. He is easier to manage because there's nothing pulling him in unpredictable directions. Spontaneity disappears. Risk becomes unattractive. Adventure feels irresponsible. The system has successfully redirected his energy. What once went toward exploration now goes toward maintenance. What once fueled creativity now fuels stability. The man becomes a caretaker of a structure rather than a builder of a life. This redirection doesn't feel like loss while it's happening. It feels like being needed. And being needed feels good at first. But need is not the same as meaning. The man's internal world grows quieter. His emotional range flattens. He experiences fewer highs and fewer lows. Life becomes manageable but muted. This is where many men begin to feel a vague dissatisfaction they can't name. They say they're tired. They say they're stressed. They say they're burnt out. But underneath those words is something deeper. They're bored in a way rest can't fix. They're empty in a way comfort can't fill. And because the loss happened gradually, they can't point to what's missing. They only know something essential is gone. The system doesn't care. A man without passions is efficient. He doesn't resist. He doesn't demand. He doesn't disrupt. He keeps things running, and from the outside, this looks like success. A stable home, a reliable provider, a predictable routine. But inside, the man feels like he's disappearing. The tragedy is that no one notices because he still functions, he still produces, he still shows up. He's just no longer alive in the way he once was. This is the point where many men begin to mistake numbness for peace. They tell themselves this is what contentment feels like, that intensity was youthful excess, that calm means maturity. But calm without joy is not peace, it's sedation. And once a man is sedated, he doesn't fight the system, he maintains it. Once a man's passions are gone, autonomy becomes the final casualty. This is where the transformation completes itself, where a grown man no longer assumes he has the right to act, but waits to be allowed. It doesn't begin with permission. It begins with consideration. What do you think if I go out tonight? How would you feel about me buying this? The language sounds respectful, cooperative, mature, and again, taken in isolation it is. Adults should consider their partners. That's not the issue. The issue is the direction of travel. Consideration slowly becomes consultation. Consultation slowly becomes approval. Approval slowly becomes permission. And permission, once normalized, redefines the entire power structure. The man doesn't notice the shift because it feels gradual and reasonable. He tells himself he's being thoughtful, that he's avoiding conflict, that he's communicating. But beneath the language, something fundamental has changed. He no longer assumes agency. Before acting, he checks. Before deciding, he asks. Before wanting, he calculates the emotional cost. His default state is no longer autonomy, but restraint. This is not about specific decisions. It's about who has the authority to decide at all. When a man must negotiate for ordinary adult behavior, his status has shifted from equal to subordinate. Not by force, but by habit. I've seen men ask permission to see their parents, to buy basic personal items, to rest. And what's striking is not the asking, but the tone, the careful phrasing, the preemptive justifications, the implicit apology for having a desire in the first place. That apology tells you everything. The man has internalized the belief that his wants are secondary, that his preferences are disruptive, that his autonomy is something that must be earned through good behavior. This creates a psychological state that mirrors childhood. In childhood, autonomy is conditional. Permission is required. Approval determines freedom. And when this dynamic reappears in adulthood, the psychological consequences are severe. The man stops exercising independent judgment. Why risk it when asking is safer? When permission shifts responsibility away from him. If the decision goes poorly, it wasn't his fault. He was allowed to do it. If it goes well, no one notices. This reinforces passivity. The man learns that initiative is dangerous, that agency carries risk, that it's better to defer than to decide. Over time, this leads to learned helplessness. When someone's actions are consistently filtered through another's approval, they eventually stop generating actions altogether. They wait, they react, they comply, they become careful. This carefulness is often praised. He's thoughtful, he's considerate, he's easy to live with. But ease is purchased with erasure. The man's inner life becomes smaller. He edits thoughts before they become words. He suppresses impulses before they become intentions. He doesn't explore because exploration requires permission he doesn't want to request. And guilt ensures compliance. Every desire that doesn't serve the household is reframed as selfishness. Want time alone. You're neglecting your family. Want to pursue a hobby? You're wasting resources. Want to maintain friendships? You're prioritizing others. No matter what he wants, there's a moral argument against it. This guilt is layered. Practical guilt, moral guilt, emotional guilt, social guilt. And the man absorbs all of it. He tells himself he's choosing sacrifice, that this is love, that good men put others first. And because he wants to be good, he complies. This is the most insidious part of the system. The man becomes the architect of his own cage. No one needs to deny him explicitly. He denies himself preemptively. He doesn't ask for more because he's already decided it would be wrong. He internalizes the rules so completely that enforcement becomes unnecessary. At this stage, the man's sense of self is fragile. He feels anxious when acting independently. He feels relief when given direction. He is more comfortable being told what to do than deciding for himself. This anxiety manifests physically. Restlessness, insomnia, digestive issues, a constant low-level tension. He lives in a state of vigilance, always scanning for potential disapproval. This makes him predictable. Anxious people are easier to manage than confident ones. They avoid conflict. They prioritize peace over justice. They choose safety over truth. The system thrives on this. The man no longer trusts himself enough to push back. Even when something feels wrong, he hesitates. He doubts his perception. He assumes he must be missing something. So he adapts again. He reframes his life as chosen rather than constrained. He tells himself he prefers stability, that freedom was overrated, that adventure is irresponsible. This reframing protects him from the pain of recognizing what he's lost. But the body remembers. There's a persistent tightness in his chest, a quiet resentment he doesn't express, a sense that he's living someone else's life. He doesn't talk about it because he doesn't have the language, and because everyone around him seems to be doing the same thing. This normalization completes the transformation. The man looks around and sees other men living similarly restricted lives. He assumes this is universal, inevitable, the price of adulthood. So he stops fighting. He becomes compliant not because he was defeated, but because he was convinced there was nothing to fight for. This is how autonomy disappears. Not with chains, not with commands, but with polite questions that slowly remove the assumption of freedom. By the time the man realizes he no longer moves, unless permitted, the habit is entrenched. The fear of reclaiming agency feels greater than the loss of it. And so he remains where he is, contained, managed, useful. Once autonomy is gone, identity follows. This is the stage most men never see clearly because it doesn't feel like something is being taken. It feels like something is being merged, blended, smoothed into harmony. The language shifts first. I becomes we. My preference becomes our lifestyle. My opinion becomes what works for us. On the surface, this sounds healthy, mature, cooperative. And again, in balanced relationships it can be. But here the merger is not symmetrical. Individual edges are sanded down in the name of compatibility. Differences become inconveniences. Dissent becomes disloyalty. The man learns that harmony requires alignment, and alignment requires self-editing. So he edits. He moderates his opinions to avoid friction. He adjusts his humor to match her sensibilities. He changes his music, his routines, his tastes. Not because he's ordered to, but because experience has taught him which parts of himself create tension. Over time, the man's unique traits fade. His distinctiveness dulls. He becomes easier to live with, but harder to recognize. This identity erosion doesn't trigger alarm because it happens slowly. The man doesn't wake up one day as someone else. He adapts incrementally until the distance between who he was and who he is feels abstract. And when he does feel the gap, he explains it away. He tells himself he's grown, that he's matured, that the old version of himself was naive, impulsive, selfish. He reframes loss as evolution. This reframing is critical. The system doesn't just change present behavior. It rewrites the past to justify the present. Men begin to remember their pre-marriage lives as empty, their friendships as shallow, their independence as irresponsible. They degrade their former selves in order to tolerate their current constraints. This memory modification serves a psychological purpose. It reduces cognitive dissonance. If the past was flawed, then the present must be better. And if the present is better, there's no reason to mourn what was lost. But something doesn't add up. The man notices a strange contradiction. The woman who was initially drawn to his confidence, ambition, and individuality now seems frustrated by his passivity. She wonders why he doesn't lead, why he lacks initiative, why he's so agreeable. She doesn't connect the dots. She doesn't see that the traits she now finds unattractive are the direct result of the system that required him to suppress the traits she once admired. This is the quiet tragedy. The man becomes a diluted version of himself to maintain the relationship, only to discover that dilution erodes desire. He is optimized for stability, not vitality. And the system offers no way back. By this stage, comparison becomes a trap. The man looks around and sees other married men living similarly constrained lives. They joke about it. They normalize it. They accept it. This creates a distorted baseline. He assumes this is universal, that all men lose themselves this way, that what he's experiencing is just how life works. What he doesn't see is selection bias. The men still visible in these social circles are the ones who adapted, the ones who complied, the ones who stayed. The men who resisted were filtered out. Divorce removed some. Social exile removed others. Quiet withdrawal removed the rest. So the sample the man observes is incomplete. He compares his situation to other compromised situations and concludes his is normal. This comparison reinforces compliance. If everyone is living this way, then there's no alternative, no escape, no reason to question. And so identity continues to erode. The man no longer knows what he enjoys, independent of the relationship. He struggles to answer simple questions about himself. What do you like? What do you want? What do you believe? These questions feel uncomfortable, almost inappropriate, because wanting has become dangerous. This internal confusion creates a deep psychological fatigue. The man expends energy maintaining a version of himself that fits the system. He performs adulthood rather than inhabits it. He becomes a supporting character in someone else's story. And the longer he plays that role, the harder it becomes to imagine being the protagonist again. At this stage, the costs of leaving feel insurmountable. Financial entanglement makes independence expensive. Social integration makes departure isolating. Emotional dependency makes autonomy frightening. Years of managed decision-making have weakened his confidence. Years of external validation have replaced internal authority. Years of service-based identity have left him unsure of his intrinsic worth. Even if he recognizes something is wrong, he doesn't know where to begin. How does he rebuild friendships after years of absence? How does he rediscover passions after years of suppression? How does he trust his own judgment after years of deferral? The system has created what economists call switching costs. Barriers that make change feel riskier than stagnation. So the man stays, not because he's happy, but because staying feels safer than leaving. This is how identity loss becomes permanent. The final step is internal adoption. The man stops seeing his situation as imposed. He adopts the system's language as his own philosophy. Happy wife, happy life. Marriage is about compromise. Real men put family first. These phrases become his justifications, his shields against doubt. He believes them sincerely. That sincerity is what makes the system stable. When the oppressed internalize the logic of their oppression, resistance disappears. The man becomes the enthusiastic advocate for his own domestication. He teaches the next generation the same lessons. He models the same sacrifices. He passes on the same constraints. And so the cycle continues. By the time identity is fully replaced, there's nothing left to reclaim. At least, that's how it feels. The man doesn't remember who he was. And what you can't remember, you can't mourn. Before we end, there is one lesson that matters more than everything you've just heard. A meaningful life is not built on usefulness alone. Many people mistake being needed for being valued. They confuse sacrifice with purpose. Over time, they learn to measure their worth by how much they provide, how much they endure, how much of themselves they give away to keep everything stable. And from the outside, that life can look responsible, successful, even admirable. But internally, something breaks. When you abandon your agency, when you silence your preferences, when you stop asking what kind of life actually feels true to you, you don't become mature. You become disconnected. And no amount of stability can compensate for a life that no longer feels like it belongs to you. Real partnership in any form is not about absorption. It's not about one person shrinking so another can feel secure. It's about two whole individuals choosing to stand beside each other without erasing themselves in the process. Love should add weight to your life, not replace its foundation. If there's one thing to remember, it's this: you are allowed to exist for your own sake. Your desires are not defects. Your autonomy is not immaturity. A life that only makes sense to others will eventually stop making sense to you. If this message resonated, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below what part of this hit closest to home for you. And if you value conversations that go beneath the surface of everyday life, consider subscribing to the channel. Calmly, intentionally,